I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, development stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a film made. I'm staying in the 1990s and, as always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the film in question. I will come to the story the other side of this.
It's like organized confusion. Over 300-400 degrees in temperature. And then you just got these guys that are running into this building. Everybody else is running out. And these lunatics are running in.
Is it a real Chicago fireman's outfit I see on you?
It's in the blood, Willie.
When I heard that both McCaffrey brothers were being assigned here at this station together, my heart was filled with a sudden desire to transfer.
Run, damn you! Let's just have one drill, Lieutenant. Now one for the company and one for me.
You have a bad day here, somebody dies.
Check that door for heat.
I mean, is that an accident or is it arson?
I'll get that answer as soon as I do.
We're starting to get the feeling that your office is dragging out this case.
So that then was a clip from the trailer from 1991's Backdraft, using a little bit of James Horner's wonderful score for the film Glory in there. Backdraft written by Gregory Wyden, directed by Ron Howard, starring Kurt Russell, William Baldwin, Scott Glenn, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Rebecca De Mornay, Donald Sutherland and Robert De Niro. And it was back in 1987 that a writer by the name of, wouldn't you know it, Gregory Wyden, who'd been a firefighter for several years, pitched the idea of what would become the film Backdraft to a producer by the name of Richard B. Lewis. Now, Lewis at this point was at Trilogy Entertainment. He was quite taken with the idea, and so Wyden and Lewis, they packaged this up and they found a buyer fairly quickly at the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, headed by Dino De Laurentiis. Now, as much as Dino De Laurentiis is a legendary producer in Hollywood circles, I mean, go back to the Flash Gordon episode of this particular podcast for more on him, his group was not having the best of times towards the end of the 1980s, so much so that the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group went bankrupt. And really what should have been a fairly quick story of getting a film to the screen suddenly got just a little bit more complex. The bankruptcy meant that the rights were in flux just for a little bit. They eventually came back to Wyden and Lewis, and so now by October of 1988, so we're over a year into the story already, the idea had come across the desk of one Ron Howard. Now, Ron Howard's background, of course, is in acting, but across the 1980s, well, he made his directorial debut in 1977 with Grand Theft Auto, nothing to do with the game that would come out many years later. But it was across the 1980s that he started to make a splash in more ways than one with directorial efforts such as Night Shift, Splash, Cocoon and 1988's Willow, which is where we find him in this story, because he was preparing. I mean, he had another film just on his docket at that point, the 1989 comedy Parenthood that I've covered in a previous episode of this podcast. Parenthood is a masterpiece. I must have that chat again at some point. And he was a director in demand, and no wonder. He could make impressive commercial films on a relatively modest budget. He'd got several hits to his belt as well, and through his Imagine Entertainment company that he ran along with producer Brian Grazer, there was a feeling that the firefighter project, Backdraft, let's go with, well, it was something he could get behind. Now, the version of the film that was being mooted at this point was a lot cheaper than the one we ultimately got. It was going to cost $15 million, and Howard thought he could probably shoot this in the summer of 1989. The focus of the story being quite narrow at that point, that it would focus on an arson investigation amongst a crew of firefighters. But Howard kept noodling with the story. He wasn't particularly satisfied. He didn't think they'd nailed it, and he wanted to expand it a little. In fact, he wanted to bring in the story of a pair of brothers at the heart of the movie, and he wanted other writers to come in to help him fashion that bit of the story. And as such, Gregory Wyden found himself just sidelined as other screenwriters came in to take a crack at the Backdraft script. So, as Wyden would tell the Wall Street Journal, in fact, he felt he was, quote, banished for a year as 3 new writers were assigned. So, come the start of 1989, I've got the name of one of the writers for a start. That would be Michael Bortman, and he was linked with the movie. But by the autumn of 89, there wasn't a completed script in place, and there wasn't even a certainty that Ron Howard was actually going to direct this. He was in post-production on Parenthood that had moved up his schedule, and script rewrites on the Backdraft project were still going. In fact, they were still going at the start of 1990 as well. Enter stage left legendary action director Stephen E. D'Souza, and he was hired to particularly look at the story of the 2 brothers that Howard wanted at the heart of the film. But again, he was wavering in terms of whether he would direct it himself. Would this be a project that Imagine would produce, for instance, or would it be one that Howard stepped behind the camera again for? Now, Howard would ultimately direct, but the script was continuing to elude him for a while, and he had other projects on his docket as well. I mean, Far and Away was slowly coming to fruition as well. But could the Backdraft project be salvaged, and could it be salvaged in time to fit the gap that Howard had in his schedule? Well, the answer to that was yes. And it was salvaged in part by bringing the original writer back. Who knew? Gregory Wyden was brought back onto the film in early 1990, and he spent what he described as several days getting the script back to a place that Ron Howard was happy with. So much so that Ron Howard decided, yeah, all right, this is going to be my next film. And with Universal backing him via his Imagine banner, and why wouldn't Universal back him given the money that Parenthood had just made for the studio, the plan now was, let's film this in the summer of 1990, and Backdraft would then be released in the summer of 1991, that Universal would have another tentpole picture to add to its summer lineup, and with a trusted director at the helm of it. Casting wise, though, this had expanded. That original story of an arson investigator would still be in there, but then so would the brothers' story as well. And as much as the promotion to Backdraft promoted the fact that it was an ensemble film, there were a lot of names above the title here, it was still the core of these 2 brothers at the heart of it, the McCaffrey brothers. And lots of auditions were taking place. In fact, if you go online, you can see Robert Downey Jr.'s audition for a role in Backdraft. Keanu Reeves was said to have put his name forward as well. Brad Pitt, too, was also said to have been put on tape as a potential for the film, but it would be William Baldwin who would ultimately emerge victorious. And there's a lovely story. I couldn't get a double source on it, but it's worth just noting it, that Baldwin actually had a commitment to a role in Ridley Scott's Thelma and Louise at the same time that he had to release, and that opened the door apparently for Brad Pitt, who didn't get the Backdraft role, but got really a career opening role in Thelma and Louise. Now, quite how true or not that is, I don't know, but I did like the story, so I'll just throw it in with that caveat to it. Now, someone who was in the air when he first heard of the movie was Kurt Russell. That Kurt Russell was a keen pilot, and he was flying with a man called Tom Cruise. Who knew? And so Cruise started talking to Russell while they were on this flight about taking on a potential role in the film Days of Thunder that Cruise was lining up. And Russell really wasn't biting at that point. I have covered Days of Thunder on a previous episode, but as Entertainment Weekly noted, Cruise changed the subject it wrote to another script he'd been considering, a drama about 2 firefighter brothers working side by side in a Chicago firehouse. Now, this was far more interesting to Kurt Russell, and so once they landed and he got home, Russell called up his agent. It's like, tell me more about this firefighter film. And Ron Howard, he freely admitted he'd been after Tom Cruise to lead the movie. Why wouldn't he? And the ideal for a while was that Kurt Russell and Tom Cruise would be brothers. They would eventually work together on Vanilla Sky, but it didn't pan out. out on this particular project, because instead, whilst Cruise was interested for a while, he had commitments elsewhere. It wouldn't be long until he worked with Ron Howard, far and away, again, just around the corner. And Russell found himself paired with William Baldwin instead at the head of the ensemble that was attracting some impressive names. I mean, Jennifer Jason Leigh and Rebecca De Mornay came aboard fairly quickly, as did Donald Sutherland. Then there was the small matter of Robert De Niro, who was at the point in his career where he was starting to look at taking cameo roles on in films such as this, and this would be a small supporting role, but an important one, as the arson investigator. As Ron Howard told The Hollywood Reporter, he was hugely impressed with De Niro's process, that De Niro met different fire investigators, said Howard, and when they rolled cameras, I realised he adopted the posture of one guy, the attitude of another, and sort of cadence and commanded the vernacular from a third. And Howard reflected, I realised this is what De Niro does. It was a masterclass in preparation and application. But then preparation was running right the way through the Backdraft project, and with good reason. This was pre the era where you would just get a load of visual effects in to do the work for you. Howard and his team knew that if they wanted to put roaring fires on screen, they needed roaring fires. And it was several months in advance that work was underway on just how do you present fire in the most interesting way on screen? How do you make the explosions work? And so the production team was working on that. Meanwhile, the ensemble cast, just ahead of filming, was sent off to work with the Chicago Fire Academy because, again, Howard knew that for the fire sequences to work, he needed to put his actors in the midst of them. He needed it to be faithful. And so De Niro, on the one hand, was doing his stuff, but the actors too, the rest of the actors, were going through the process and learning the basics of what they had to represent on screen. Filming would begin on the 25th of July 1990. A lot of the production took place in Chicago, as you would expect, given that it's a Chicago set film, that in some cases they brought sets onto location shoots as well, just so that they could get the fire, really, to wreak havoc with the fire in the locations that they'd chosen. There were 16 weeks scheduled for the shoot, lots and lots of practical work. And I mean, all right through to right towards the end of the shoot, a major road in Chicago was shut off for a funeral sequence that required extras, and out went the call for extras, and in the end 600 off-duty firefighters came along and took part. You see off-duty firefighters in the movie as well. That the drive for authenticity, and also, face it, respecting firefighters was very key in Howard's mind. But still, the practical problems of filming fire were a big challenge. If one of us, for instance, just set something on fire, I'm not suggesting we would, but just a fire in the middle of nowhere, fire then produces a lot of smoke and a lot of ash. And that wasn't really going to look particularly cinematic, nor was it helpful if you want to look at Kurt Russell's head when there's a load of smoke and a load of ash blowing into his face. That they knew that it would obscure the view of the audience, and it just wouldn't quite look right. You look at how the dramatic, the lengths really they go to present rain looking authentic on screen, and how they have to cheat to do that. They were sort of having to do this with fire as well. Now, Hollywood for on-screen fire tends to use propane as its fuel of choice. This is not a how-to guide. Do not try any of this at home. You are not suing me. But to get the kind of black smoke effect that they needed for the camera, what they added was a little bit of diesel as well. Then they brought in assorted chemicals just to give extra colour to the flames as well. For the tracks that they needed to lay for the flames to follow, they put glue on the floor, they put fuel there as well. And in the end, the bill for the fire effects came in at just over $1 million, which sounds to me like a bit of a bargain, but then I didn't have to pay for it. The total budget for the film had ballooned up to the 35-40 million range, unsurprising given the size of the cast. But it's interesting just what a small proportion the acclaimed effects in the film took out of that budget. Again, had this been done with computers, you would expect that bill to be an awful lot higher. The person who was charged with shooting all of this was a director by the name of Mikhail Salomon. He would go off and direct features himself. Hard Rain was one of his that came a little bit further down the line. And he knew he had to keep his cameras safe. And so he used a product called a Claremont camera firebox. Now, Claremont have not paid me for inclusion in this podcast. I don't even know if they still exist. But for the purposes of this story, it meant that the camera could be housed in secure casing that would resist the heat. And it meant that the camera could be put in the midst of the action. Howard, though, would, in a retrospective piece with the Hollywood Reporter, just muse over the fact that it was still dangerous for all the safety tips and all the safety, all the concern they had for safety on the film. He did say we had gas burners and fire retardants and a team of 10 Chicago firefighters around us at all times with extinguishers at the ready, but they needed to move in at times because Howard said no matter how well planned, we just never knew when the fire was going to get away from us, and it did on occasion. I mean, pity the camera operator who was put in the fireproof suit and given a steady cam, given a handheld cam to go through the flames with the handheld camera and capture some of the close-up footage that we get in the film. But still, even though the actors and even though the crew were facing down the flames, they weren't complaining about it really, because they knew that what they were representing was what people do, what other people do, less paid people do, on a day-to-day basis, that they knew that they couldn't really grumble when actual firefighters were having to face this regularly. And as Russell said in a piece, he just said all of us were getting burned every day. He said your hair would burn, you put this gel on to keep your skin from burning, but it also attracted these little bits of ash which got stuck to your face. Billy, William Baldwin, got set on fire twice. I got set on fire 3 times. Scott Glenn got fried once. Russell threw in, there's a sentence as well. And I mean, Russell did add that one of the firemen who worked with us and won commendations and awards as a firefighter said that in 14 years he'd never got burned on the job till he did this, quote, goddamn movie, Now I've Been Burned Twice. But still, as Entertainment Weekly noted, there were no serious injuries during the production of Backdraft, that the actors were able to be in the heart of the dangerous scenes, but the precautions paid off. And as the article said, these actors are in there flat out doing it, putting out fires. Most of that work, again, done on sets, but when you think about it, it's one of those things that a second take of a lot of this was very, very tricky, because if you're burning a set, you're burning a set. And so while they put a special paint coating on the walls just to give them a chance at getting extra takes, they knew that for the first, they knew that they had to nail this a lot of the time, first time, because otherwise the thing was bluntly burned. Filming would wrap up on December the 8th of 1990, and Backdraft would be preparing for what would be a very, very, very busy summer. Summer of 1991, after all, was the season of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, of Terminator 2. Bruce Willis was going to be back with Hudson Hawk. Big things were expected of that. And so Universal had positioned this for a May 1991 release in the US, and was spending on the promotion with, a poster that made a lot of the flames, but also a lot of the star names. In fact, the trailer that you got a clip from right at the start there was not shy about hitting you with the full, as much of the cast really as it could possibly put on screen, and building up the fact that you were going to get this real spectacle for your money. And in fact, when the film went in front of reviewers, that was the feedback that they were quickly getting, that the critical response to Backdraft was so on the drama at the heart of it, but the special effects were just universally praised. The fact that practically what they'd been able to realise looked so good was universally praised. The performances as well, there's a lot of good performances in Backdraft. It's the kind of ensemble where everyone gets a little bit of space to do what they do, and those were relatively well praised as well. There's a lot of upbeat notices for the film. It's only the story really, the fairly straightforward story of two brothers at the heart, ironically enough, was the bit where it attracted the most criticism. But still, there was confidence. However, the summer of 1991 was an interesting one in Hollywood, because this was the year really where a lot of films started to misfire a little bit. And so we go to the Memorial Day weekend of 1991 when Backdraft opened. And in fairness, it opened in first place, 15 million over the extended Memorial Day weekend, ahead of the number 2 film, which was What About Bob, and comfortably ahead of Hudson Hawk. Big things had been expected of that That opened with a whimper in third place. There was also Thelma and Louise was around. That opened the same weekend. Only the Lonely, the new film from the John Hughes staple, starring John Candy. Not doing great guns. Drop Dead Fred with Rick Mayall. That was in the top 10 just about. FX2, Madonna, Truth or Dare, Switch. That was the competition that it was up against. Universal scheduling meant that it had got a little bit of space to itself. I mean, the biggest opening film the following week was Soap Dish, the ensemble comedy. I really like Soap Dish, actually. I don't mention it very often, but it's well worth seeking out. And Backdraft held the top spot, 9.1 million on its second weekend, dropping only 28% of its business. Not a lot of competition. Just to give an overview of how light the competition was, Home Alone was in 9th place on its 29th week of release. Stone Cold had come in at 10th. I remember Stone Cold, that kind of action film. More of those on the big screen, please. It was City Slickers the following week that knocked it off the top chart. The surprise hit of the summer, really, that was. And City Slickers helped itself to 13 million. Spike Lee's Jungle Fever was up against it on its third week as well. But Backdraft was kind of holding its own, and it wasn't until Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves came along, written by Penn Denson and John Watson, who I've had on this podcast before, who were also involved in Backdraft, that really its run at the box office started to peter out. And then, again, a curious summer. Julia Roberts in Dying Young followed the week after, and big things expected of that never really happened. The Rocketeer, big things expected of that, lots of acclaim, not much box office. And it was reliables, really, like a Naked Gun sequel and a Terminator sequel. That were the kind of things that were making the money that summer. Backdraft, though, it didn't drop out the top 10 for a good 7-8 weeks. And in fact, by the time it had completed its run in US cinemas, it was up to 77 million. And we'd look at that kind of number, not an awful lot by today's standards, but at that point, that was a pretty reasonable return, particularly in such a flat summer where so many films had misfired. Backdraft was just regarded as one that had held its own. Overseas, it did roughly around the same amount of money as well. And there was also further acclaim coming a little bit down the road for it. That, come the Academy Awards, well, unsurprisingly, Backdraft was in the mix. It was up for sound effects editing, and visual effects. However, how's this for luck? Found itself up against Terminator 2 Judgment Day in all three categories and promptly lost. That notwithstanding, there was sufficient interest in Backdraft for Universal to revisit it, 20, 30 years later. It was in 2018 came the news that we were getting a Backdraft 2 that would also see William Baldwin back. This was one of Universal's straight-to-DVD jobs, and in the end you did get William Baldwin, you got a bit of Donald Sutherland in there as well, but it was pretty much a different thing, not aimed at cinemas in the slightest. The reception to it was nowhere near as good, and whilst you can find the film out there, I don't think many people are particularly championing it. And in fact, the final word on Backdraft really goes to Ron Howard, who, when he's been looking at retrospective pieces to do with the film, and it comes up an awful lot, he suggested that the future for Backdraft might be as a TV series. Not a bad idea, perhaps. The 1991 ensemble summer drama, though, stands pretty much alone, even if you can't track down a copy of that straight-to-DVD sequel. If you like this podcast and wouldn't mind giving it a bit of support, firstly, thank you. Secondly, there are three main ways you can do so, short of listening to it, and I'm very grateful that you're listening to it. If you want to put some money in the pot and financially support this podcast and all that goes into it, then if you head to patreon.com/SimonBrew, what you get there is, in return for putting some funds in, you find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. You get the podcast early, pretty much every week. You also get the podcast completely ad-free too. So that's patreon.com/SimonBrew. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. For I can't tell you how valuable this is to independent podcasts, because it's things like that affect the algorithms and the metrics and all the fancy stuff I don't quite understand, and help get podcasts like this noticed. And the other way too is if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps me a lot too. Meanwhile, Film Stories isn't just a podcast, it's also print magazines as well, proper old style print film magazines. And what we champion through through Film Stories magazine is kind of the cinema that's been neglected a little bit while the glare's been on all the superheroes. I like superheroes, but they're covered extensively elsewhere. Instead, we seek out kind of the films that just really, I think, deserve a little bit more limelight. I'm up to issue 46 of Film Stories magazine now. I'm working on issue 47 as this has been recorded. You can purchase copies at store.filmstories.co.uk. I'm really proud of all the stories we've managed to get into print so far. Hopefully a lot more to come. And then we've got Film Junior magazine, a very special place in my heart for this one. This is, to my knowledge, the only print film magazine for young film fans, primarily written by them as well. I'm doing some fundraising for that too at the moment, but if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can pick yourself up a copy. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/YouTube, I was going to say, youtube.com/Film Stories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. We're doing loads of stuff on there at the moment. Do give it a look if you don't mind. And if you head to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can buy our print magazines, our Blu-rays and other such paraphernalia. That's it though for this episode. I'm going off to watch another load of films now, and so that leaves me to say that the main thing is, as always, you all stay safe and well. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. I will be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Ta-ta.